The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 1. The Cycle of Society. Modern science, obsessed with the greatness of its physical discoveries and the idea of the sole existence of matter, has long attempted to base upon physical data even its study of soul and mind, and of those workings of nature in man and animal, in which a knowledge of psychology is as important as any of the physical sciences. Its very psychology founded itself upon physiology and the scrutiny of the brain and nervous system. It is not surprising, therefore, that in history and sociology, attention should have been concentrated on the external data, laws, institutions, rights, customs, economic factors, and developments, while the deeper psychological elements, so important in the activities of a mental, emotional, ideative being like man, have been very much neglected. This kind of science would explain history and social development as much as possible by economic necessity or motive, by economy understood in its widest sense. There are even historians who deny or put aside as of a very subsidiary importance the working of the idea and the influence of the thinker in the development of human institutions. The French Revolution, it is thought, would have happened just as it did and when it did, by economic necessity. Even if Rousseau and Voltaire had never written, and the 18th century philosophic movement in the world of thought had never worked out its bold and radical speculations. Recently, however, the all-sufficiency of matter to explain mind and soul has begun to be doubted, and a movement of emancipation from the obsession of physical science has set in, although as yet it has not gone beyond a few awkward and rudimentary stumblings. Still, there is the beginning of a perception that behind the economic motives and causes of social and historical development, there are profound psychological, even perhaps soul factors, and in pre-war Germany, the metropolis of rationalism and materialism, but the home also, for a century and a half, of new thought and original tendencies, good and bad, beneficent and disastrous. A first psychological theory of history was conceived and presented by an original intelligence. The earliest attempts in a new field are seldom entirely successful, and the German historian, originator of this theory, seized on a luminous idea, but was not able to carry it very far or probe very deep. He was still haunted by a sense of the greater importance of the economic factor, and like most European science, his theory related, classified, and organized phenomena much more successfully than it explained them. Nevertheless, its basic idea formulated a suggestive and illuminating truth, and it is worthwhile following up some of the suggestions it opens out in the light especially of Eastern thought and experience. The theorist Lamprecht, basing himself on European and particularly on German history, supposed that human society progresses through certain distinct psychological stages, which he terms respectively symbolic, typal, and conventional, individualist, and subjective. This development forms, then, a sort of psychological cycle through which a nation or a civilization is bound to proceed. Obviously, such classifications are likely to err by rigidity and to substitute a mental straight line for the coils and zigzags of nature. The psychology of man and his societies is too complex, too synthetical, of many-sided and intermixed tendencies to satisfy any such rigorous and formal analysis. Nor does this theory of a psychological cycle tell us what is the inner meaning of its successive phases, or the necessity of their succession, or the term and end towards which they are driving. But still, to understand natural laws, whether of mind or matter, it is necessary to analyze their working into its discoverable elements, main constituents, dominant forces, though these may not actually be found anywhere in isolation. I will leave aside the Western thinker's own dealings with his idea. The suggestive names he has offered us, if we examine their intrinsic sense and value, may yet throw some light on the thickly veiled secret of our historic evolution. And this is the line on which it would be most useful to investigate. Undoubtedly, wherever we can seize human society in what to us seems its primitive beginnings or early stages, no matter whether the race is comparatively cultured or savage, or economically advanced or backward, we do find a strongly symbolic mentality that governs, or at least pervades its thought, customs, and institutions. Symbolic, but of what? We find that this social stage is always religious, and actively imaginative in its religion. For symbolism and a widespread imaginative or intuitive religious feeling have a natural kinship, and especially in earlier or primitive formations, they have gone always together. When man begins to be predominantly intellectual, skeptical, ratiocinative, he is already preparing for an individualist society, and the age of symbols and the age of conventions have passed, or are losing their virtue. The symbol, then, is of something which man feels to be present behind himself and his life and his activities. The divine, the gods, the vast and deep unnameable, a hidden, living, and mysterious nature of things. All his religious and social institutions, all the moments and phases of his life are to him symbols in which he seeks to express what he knows or guesses of the mystic influences that are behind his life and shape and govern, or at the least intervene in its movements. If we look at the beginnings of Indian society, the far-off Vedic age, which we no longer understand, for we have lost that mentality, we see that everything is symbolic. The religious institution of sacrifice governs the whole society and all its hours and moments, and the ritual of the sacrifice is at every turn and in every detail, as even a cursory study of the Brahmanas and Upanishads ought to show us, mystically symbolic. The theory that there was nothing in the sacrifice except a propitiation of nature gods for the gaining of worldly prosperity and of paradise is a misunderstanding by a later humanity, which had already become profoundly affected by an intellectual and practical bent of mind. Practical even in its religion, and even in its own mysticism and symbolism, and therefore could no longer enter into the ancient spirit. Not only the actual religious worship, but also the social institutions of the time were penetrated through and through with the symbolic spirit. Take the hymn of the Rig Veda, which is supposed to be a marriage hymn for the union of a human couple, and was certainly used as such in the later Vedic ages. Yet the whole sense of the hymn turns about the successive marriages of Surya, daughter of the sun, with different gods, and the human marriage is quite a subordinate matter, overshadowed and governed entirely by the divine and mystic figure, and is spoken of in the terms of that figure. Mark, however, that the divine marriage here is not, as it would be in later ancient poetry, a decorative image or poetical ornamentation used to set off and embellish the human union. On the contrary, the human is an inferior figure and image of the divine. The distinction marks off the entire contrast between that more ancient mentality and our modern regard upon things. This symbolism influenced for a long time Indian ideas of marriage, and is even now conventionally remembered, though no longer understood or effective. We may note also, in passing, that the Indian ideal of the relation between man and woman has always been governed by the symbolism of the relation between the Purusha and Prakriti. In the Veda, Nri and Gna, the male and female divine principles in the universe. Even there is to some degree a practical correlation between the position of the female sex and this idea. In the earlier Vedic times, when the female principle stood on a sort of equality with the male in the symbolic cult, though with a certain predominance for the latter, woman was as much the mate as the adjunct of man. In later times, when the Prakriti has become subject in idea to the Purusha, the woman also depends entirely on the man, exists only for him, and has hardly even a separate spiritual existence. In the Tantric Shakta religion, which puts the female principle highest, there is an attempt which could not get itself translated into social practice, even as this tantric cult could never entirely shake off the subjugation of the Vedantic idea, to elevate woman and make her an object of profound respect and even of worship. Or let us take, for this example will serve us best, the Vedic institution of the fourfold order, Katuvarnya, miscalled the system of the four castes. For caste is a conventional, Varnya a symbolic and typal institution. We are told that the institution of the four orders of society was the result of an economic evolution complicated by political causes. Very possibly. But the important point is that it was not so regarded, and could not be so regarded by the men of that age. For while we are satisfied when we have found the practical and material causes of a social phenomenon, and do not care to look farther, they cared little, or subordinately, for its material factors, and looked always first and foremost for its symbolic, religious, or psychological significance. This appears in the Purusha Sukta of the Veda, where the four orders are described as having sprung from the body of the creative deity, from his head, arms, thighs, and feet. To us, this is merely a poetical image, and its sense is that the Brahmins were the men of knowledge, the Kshatriyas the men of power, the Vaishyas the producers and support of society, the Shudras its servants. As if that were all, as if the men of those days would have so profound a reverence for mere poetical figures like this of the body of Brahma, or that other of the marriages of Surya, would have built upon them elaborate systems of ritual and sacred ceremony, enduring institutions, great demarcations of social type and ethical discipline. We read always our own mentality into that of these ancient forefathers, and it is therefore that we can find in them nothing but imaginative barbarians. To us, poetry is a revel of intellect and fancy, imagination a plaything and caterer for our amusement, our entertainer, the nautch girl of the mind. But to the men of old, the poet was a seer, a revealer of hidden truths. imagination no dancing courtesan, but a priestess in God's house, commissioned not to spin fictions, but to image difficult and hidden truths. Even the metaphor or simile in the Vedic style is used with a serious purpose and expected to convey a reality, not to suggest a pleasing artifice of thought. The image was to these seers a relative symbol of the unrevealed, and it was used because it could hint luminously to the mind what the precise intellectual word, apt only for logical or practical thought, or to express the physical and the superficial, could not at all hope to manifest.